In Malaysia, the administration and regulation of ports are divided between federal ports, state ports, and ports administered by the Malaysia Marine Department, also known as Jabatan Laut Malaysia. This distinction is mainly based on the federal constitution, particularly the division of powers between the federal and state governments. Federal ports are governed directly by the federal government through specific federal legislation and statutory port authorities. Examples include Port Klang Authority, Johor Port Authority, and Penang Port Commission, which operate under acts such as the Port Authorities Act 1963 and the Penang Port Commission Act 1955. These ports are considered major national and international trade gateways and are supervised by the Ministry of Transport Malaysia. The federal government delegates administrative and operational powers through subsidiary laws and bylaws created under the parent legislation to regulate port activities, safety, licensing, and operations. On the other hand, state ports fall under the jurisdiction of the respective state governments based on matters listed in the state list under the 9th Schedule of the Federal Constitution. In Peninsular Malaysia, state laws are commonly referred to as enactments, while in Sabah and Sarawak they are called ordinances. These state ports are regulated through state legislation approved by the State Legislative Assembly, or DUN, and assented to by the Sultan or Governor. State authorities may also create bylaws to manage local port matters, subject to publication in the State Gazette. The state government therefore plays an important role in land administration, local development, and certain coastal management matters related to these ports. Meanwhile, several smaller ports and jetties, such as Kuala Kedah, Kuala Perlis, Lumut, and other minor ports, are administered by the Malaysia Marine Department, acting as the port authority. These ports are generally regulated under the Merchant Shipping Ordinance 1952, the Merchant Shipping Act 1952, and other maritime subsidiary legislation under the authority of the Ministry of Transport. The Malaysia Marine Department is responsible for ensuring maritime safety, navigation control, licensing of port activities, vessel traffic management, and enforcement of maritime laws at these ports. Unlike major federal ports managed by separate statutory authorities, these smaller ports are directly supervised administratively by the Marine Department to ensure smooth domestic ferry services, fishing activities, tourism operations, and regional maritime transportation. Based on the Merchant Shipping Ordinance 1952 as amended, the Minister and the Director of Marine hold distinct powers in maritime administration. The Minister is empowered to make rules, orders, and regulations for port operations, safety, vessel navigation, and shipping standards. These powers are reflected in provisions such as Sections 251 to 252, where the Minister may enact collision regulations and local port rules. In addition, under Sections 297 to 298, the Minister may prescribe regulations on cargo handling, including precautions for grain and deck cargo. At the same time, the Director of Marine has authority to issue, revoke, and replace certificates, including safety, interim, and technical certificates for ships, as provided under Sections 306L to 3060. The Director may impose conditions on certificates and may also authorize others in writing to act on his behalf in issuing or revoking certificates. Moreover, the Director has the power to issue compound penalties or license port and service undertakings under Section 10A, subject to ministerial approval for service plans. Overall, Malaysia's maritime legal system shows a clear relationship between national law and maritime administration. The MSO 1952 provides the main legal foundation, while subsidiary legislation, rules, regulations, orders, and bylaws provide detailed requirements for implementation. Each International Maritime Convention, IMC, is a distinct international treaty with its own set of articles, definitions, applicability rules, and implementation timelines, which often differ from one another and from national laws such as the Malaysia Merchant Shipping Ordinance, MSO 1952. For example, the SOLAS Convention, 1974, was adopted on the 1st November 1974 and entered into force on the 25th of May 1980. With various amendments over the years, setting distinct deadlines for different ship types and requirements, such as separate provisions for new ships, keel laid after entry into force, and existing ships, built before that date to determine which safety measures apply to them. Under SOLAS, the definitions of new ship and existing ship are explicitly provided, and certain regulations apply only to new ships constructed after specific amendment entry dates. Likewise, the MARPOL Convention has its own entry into force provisions under Article 15 that require a combination of ratifications before it becomes binding, and annexes can enter into force on different dates, depending on conditions being met for those parts of the convention. Similarly, the STCW Convention, 1978, has its own entry into force on the 28th of April 1984, with subsequent major amendments that entered into force on later dates, each establishing its own technical and training requirements for seafarers. The Maritime Labor Convention, MLC 2006, also has specific entry into force provisions tied to the number of member states and world tonnage before it becomes binding for ratifying states. Because each IMC has its own criteria and timelines, definitions such as what constitutes a ship, when a requirement becomes applicable, and whether it applies to new or existing ships differ from one convention to another. Contrastingly, Malaysia's MSO 1952 has a much broader definition of ship that covers every vessel used in navigation, including barges and non-mechanically propelled vessels, meaning that some vessels not covered under certain conventions are. For example, SOLAS does not apply to non-mechanically propelled barges, may still regulated under MSO 1952. This interplay between international convention texts, their entry into force dates, technical definitions, and domestic legislation is essential to understand when examining ship certification and compliance requirements globally and nationally.
Thank you for watching. See you soon.